Did you know that every Sunday morning, millions of Christians sing about Abraham as the father of many nations? But have you ever wondered why he was called that, if he was just another Middle Eastern man? What if I told you that the evidence, buried for centuries in ancient texts, archaeological findings, and even modern DNA research, points to something that would shake the foundation of how we see biblical history? What if Abraham, the father of faith himself, carried African blood in his veins? Today we're diving deep into one of the most controversial revelations that religious institutions have kept quiet for far too long. We're talking about Abraham's true heritage, and why understanding his African roots changes everything about how we read the Bible, how we see ourselves, and how we understand God's promise to bless all nations through one man's lineage. The promise God made to Abraham in Genesis 17:4 wasn't just words on ancient parchment. When the Almighty declared, "As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations," he wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was revealing a biological and spiritual reality that would span continents, cross every racial line, and unite humanity under one divine covenant. But here's what they don't teach you in seminary. Here's what gets glossed over in Sunday school. The reason Abraham could become the father of many nations, the reason his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, is because Abraham himself carried the genetic diversity that would allow such an expansive legacy. The DNA evidence, the archaeological discoveries, and most importantly, the biblical text itself, all point to one undeniable truth. Abraham had African blood flowing through his veins, and this revelation explains everything about his story that never quite made sense before. From his ability to seamlessly east and beyond, Abraham's African heritage is the missing puzzle piece that makes the entire biblical narrative click into place. But before we dive into the evidence, let me be crystal clear about something. This isn't about division. This isn't about one group claiming superiority over another. This is about truth. This is about understanding that from the very beginning, God's plan included every nation, every tribe, every tongue, and every people group on earth. When we discover that Abraham, the foundation of our faith, carried African blood, we're not diminishing anyone else's heritage. We're celebrating the beautiful diversity that God woven into his covenant from day one. Now, let's start with the geographic evidence that biblical scholars have been dancing around for decades. Abraham's journey begins in Ur of the Chaldeans, and this isn't just some random starting point in his story. The location of ancient Ur places Abraham's origins in a region that was deeply connected to African civilizations from the very beginning of recorded history. When we look at Genesis 11:31, we read, "And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his son's son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife. And they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldeans, to go into the land of Canaan." Now, most people picture Ur as some isolated desert outpost, but archaeological evidence paints a completely different picture. Ur was a thriving cosmopolitan city that sat at the crossroads of ancient trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with Africa. The Sumerian civilization that flourished in Ur had extensive contact with Nubian kingdoms, Egyptian dynasties, and Ethiopian trading networks. These weren't occasional encounters. These were ongoing relationships that lasted for centuries, involving intermarriage, cultural exchange, and genetic mixing that created a diverse population throughout the region. Abraham wasn't growing up in ethnic isolation. He was raised in a melting pot where African, Semitic, and other blood for generations. But here is where it gets really interesting. When we examine the trade routes that connected Ur to the outside world, we find that the primary commercial pathways led south and west toward Africa, not north and east toward what we might consider purely Semitic territories. The wealth of Ur, the sophistication of its culture, and the diversity of its population all came from this African connection. Abraham wasn't just living alongside African peoples. He was part of a community where African heritage was woven into the very fabric of society. Archaeological discoveries in the region have uncovered artwork, pottery and cultural artifacts that show clear African influences in every aspect of daily life. The religious practices, the architectural styles, even the agricultural techniques used in Abraham's homeland all show evidence of African origins or heavy African influence. This wasn't cultural appropriation. This was cultural integration that happened over generations of intermarriage and shared community life. Now, let's talk about something that most biblical commentaries barely mention, even though it's right there in the text. Abraham's relationship with Hagar wasn't just a casual arrangement for producing an heir. Genesis 16:1 tells us, "Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar." But the Hebrew text gives us clues that most English translations miss entirely. The word used to describe Hagar's position in the household suggests she wasn't just a servant who happened to be Egyptian. She was specifically chosen because of her heritage, her cultural background, and yes, her genetic contribution to Abraham's lineage. Egyptian women in Abraham's time weren't randomly selected as surrogate mothers. They were chosen because Egyptian bloodlines were considered royal, powerful, and blessed by the gods. When Sarah chose Hagar, she was deliberately bringing African nobility into Abraham's family line. And here is what's fascinating about the timing. Abraham's relationship with Hagar happens right after his journey to Egypt, described in Genesis 12. Understanding of astronomy and mathematics, and cultural practices that honored the Creator in ways that aligned perfectly with what Abraham was learning about the one true God. This wasn't cultural contamination. This was divine preparation for the covenant that was coming. When Abraham returns from Egypt with Hagar, he's not just bringing back a servant. He's bringing back an African woman who carries the wisdom, the strength, and the genetic diversity that will contribute to his promise of becoming the father of many nations. And the son that comes from this union, Ishmael, becomes the father of Arab nations, connecting Abraham's African heritage to millions of people across the Middle East and North Africa. But wait, there's more. After Sarah dies, Abraham takes another wife, and this one is even more explicit about his African connections. Genesis 25:1 states, "Then again Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah." Now, most biblical commentaries barely spend any time on Keturah, but her name and her children reveal something crucial about Abraham's ongoing relationship with African peoples. The name Keturah comes from a Hebrew root that means incense or perfume, and historical sources suggest she was from the region we now know as Ethiopia or Sudan. She wasn't just another wife. She was a woman of substance, possibly a princess or a leader in her own right, who brought significant cultural and genetic contributions to Abraham's family line. And their children, all 6 sons, became the fathers of nations that spread across Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. Genesis 25:2-4 gives us the Namus, "And she bare him Zimran, and Jokshan, and Medan, and Midian, and Ishbak, and Shoah. And Jokshan begat Sheba and Dan. And the sons of Dedan were Ashurim, and Letushim, and Lumim. And the sons of Midian, Ephakah, and Epher, and Hanak, Abida, and Eldah. All these were the children of Keturah." These aren't just random names in a genealogy. These are the founders of African nations, tribes, and kingdoms that would play crucial roles in biblical history for centuries to come. The Midianites, descended from Abraham and Keturah, become significant players in the story of Moses. The Shebans become the wealthy trading kingdom that the Queen of Sheba rules when she visits Solomon. The Dedanites establish trading posts throughout Africa and Arabia. Every single one of these family lines traces back to Abraham's union with an African woman, and every single one of them becomes a powerful nation in its own right. But here is what's really mind-blowing about this. When Abraham sends these sons away in Genesis 25:6, giving them gifts but sending them eastward, away from Isaac, is not rejecting them. He's establishing them as independent kingdoms with their own territories, their own resources, and their own relationships with the divine. But unto the sons of the concubines, which Abraham had, Abraham gave gifts, and sent them away from Isaac his son, while he yet lived eastward unto the east country. This isn't abandonment. This is royal distribution of kingdom territories. Abraham is acting like an African king, establishing multiple royal lines that will rule different regions while maintaining connection to the original covenant. This practice of establishing multiple royal houses from one patriarch is distinctly African, found in Ethiopian, Nubian, and other African royal traditions throughout history. Special outstanding scene. And speaking of Isaac, let's talk about something that's going to challenge everything you thought you knew about Abraham's promised son. When Isaac takes a wife, where does Abraham send his servant to find her? Does he look locally among the Canaanites? Does he search among nearby Semitic tribes? No. Genesis 24:4 records Abraham's instructions. But thou shalt go unto my country, to my kindred, and take a wife unto my son Isaac. Abraham sends his servant back to Mesopotamia, back to the region where African and Semitic bloodlines had been mixing for generations. And who does the servant find? Rebekah, whose family line traces back to the same diverse heritage that Abraham carries. This isn't coincidence. This is Abraham ensuring that the covenant line maintains its genetic diversity, its connection to multiple ethnic groups, and its ability to truly become the father of many nations. The cultural practices that Abraham follows throughout his life also point to African origins that most biblical scholars ignore or explain away. His approach to hospitality, described in Genesis 18, when he welcomes the 3 visitors, follows patterns that are distinctly African. The elaborate meal preparation, the ceremonial washing of feet, the immediate response to provide the best food and shelter. All of these practices align perfectly with traditional African hospitality customs that have been maintained for thousands of years. His negotiation style, when purchasing the burial site for Sarah in Genesis 23, also follows African protocols, rather than typical Middle Eastern bargaining patterns. The public ceremony, the involvement of community leaders, the elaborate speeches before getting to the actual business. All of these elements are characteristic of African decision-making processes that prioritize community consensus and public witness. Even Abraham's approach to wealth and livestock management reflects African pastoral traditions, rather than sedentary farming practices common in other ancient Near Eastern cultures. His mobility, his ability to move large herds across vast distances, his knowledge of seasonal grazing patterns, all point to expertise that would have been learned from African pastoral peoples who had perfected these techniques over centuries. Now here is where the story gets really powerful, and where we start to see how Abraham's African heritage connects to the spiritual promises that God makes to him. The covenant ceremony in Genesis 15 isn't just a religious ritual. It's a cultural practice that has deep roots in African spiritual traditions, and understanding those roots changes how we interpret the entire event. Special outstanding scene when God tells Abraham in Genesis 15:5, "Look now toward heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be." His using imagery that would have been deeply meaningful to someone familiar with African astronomical traditions. African civilizations had sophisticated understanding of celestial movements, star patterns, and cosmic cycles long before these concepts appeared in other cultures. Abraham's response to this imagery suggests familiarity with these traditions, not introduction to foreign concepts. The actual covenant ceremony, where animals are cut in half and God passes between the pieces as a smoking furnace and burning lamp, follows patterns found in ancient African covenant-making rituals. This isn't God accommodating primitive Middle Eastern customs. This is God using ceremonial forms that Abraham would recognize from his African cultural background, ensuring that the covenant is established in ways that connect to Abraham's deepest understanding of sacred commitment. And the promise itself, that Abraham's descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will serve and be afflicted for 400 years before being delivered with great substance, points directly to the African experience that was coming. Genesis 15:13-14 states, "And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them. And they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation, whom they shall serve, will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance." This prophecy finds its fulfillment not just in the Egyptian bondage of the Israelites, but in the broader African diaspora experience that would repeat throughout history. Abraham's African blood ensures that this pattern of oppression and deliverance becomes part of the genetic and spiritual memory of his descendants, creating a legacy of resilience, faith, and ultimate victory that spans continents and centuries. The journey Abraham takes from Mesopotamia through Canaan to Egypt and back again isn't just geographic movement. It's cultural integration that connects him to the great African civilizations of his time and establishes relationships that will influence his descendants for generations. When famine drives Abraham to Egypt in Genesis 12, he's not going to foreign territory. He's going to a land where his African heritage gives him natural connections and cultural understanding. The ease with which Abraham navigates Egyptian society, his ability to present Sarah in ways that attract Pharaoh's attention, his success in accumulating wealth and resources during his territory. He was someone whose African heritage gave him insider knowledge, cultural competence, and social connections that allowed him to thrive even in difficult circumstances. When Abraham returns to Canaan, he brings with him not just Egyptian wealth, but Egyptian wisdom, Egyptian understanding of governance and organization, and Egyptian spiritual insights that enhance his relationship with the one true God. The African elements of his heritage don't compete with his covenant relationship. They enrich it, deepen it, and prepare him for the global scope of God's promise to bless all nations through his lineage. This African connection explains why Abraham's descendants will repeatedly find refuge in Egypt during times of crisis. It's not just geographic convenience, it's family connection. When Isaac faces famine and considers going to Egypt, God redirects him to stay in Canaan, but the option was there because of Abraham's established relationships. When Jacob's family eventually migrates to Egypt during Joseph's administration, they're not entering completely foreign territory. They're connecting with a land where their ancestor had built bridges and established foundations. The cultural practices that Abraham establishes for his household also reflect African influences that get passed down through generations. The circumcision ritual that God commands in Genesis 17 wasn't foreign to Abraham. Archaeological evidence suggests that circumcision was already practiced in African cultures, particularly in Egypt and Ethiopia, long before it became the sign of God's covenant with Abraham. God wasn't introducing something completely new. He was taking a practice that Abraham would recognize from his African heritage and giving it sacred covenant significance. The emphasis on hospitality that characterizes Abraham's household, the respect for elders, the communal decision-making processes, the integration of spiritual practice with daily life. All of these elements align with African cultural values that have been maintained across centuries and continents. Abraham wasn't just following divine commands in isolation. He was building on cultural foundations that his African heritage had already established. But here is where we need to confront the elephant in the room. If the evidence for Abraham's African heritage is so clear, if it's supported by geography, archaeology, genetics, and biblical text, why isn't this common knowledge? Why do most Christians picture Abraham as a white Middle Eastern patriarch instead of the African-influenced leader that the evidence suggests? The answer lies in centuries of deliberate whitewashing that served the interests of colonial powers, slave-holding societies, and white supremacist ideologies that needed to distance biblical heroes from African heritage. Starting in the medieval period and accelerating during the era of Atlantic slave trade, European scholars began systematically reinterpreting biblical narratives to minimize African connections and emphasize supposed European or white Middle Eastern origins for biblical figures. This wasn't accidental misinterpretation. This was deliberate historical revision designed to support systems of oppression that required biblical justification. If Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had significant African heritage, then enslaving Africans became much harder to justify biblically. If the chosen people of God included African bloodlines from the very beginning, then racial hierarchy, based on skin color, collapsed under biblical scrutiny. So African connections got explained away, minimized, or ignored entirely. Hagar became just a servant instead of an Egyptian princess. Keturah's children became minor footnotes instead of the founders of powerful African kingdoms. The sophisticated African civilizations that Abraham encountered became primitive cultures that contributed nothing to his development. Abraham himself became a white patriarch whose African connections were just temporary incapable. But the truth has a way of surfacing, and we're living in an era where archaeological discoveries, genetic research, and honest biblical scholarship are making it impossible to maintain these false narratives. The evidence is overwhelming, and it's time for the church to acknowledge what the facts have been telling us all along. Abraham's spiritual journey wasn't just about leaving his father's house and following God's voice into an unknown land. It was about connecting the wisdom of African civilizations with the revolutionary revelation of the one true God. And when we understand this connection, everything about his story becomes more powerful, more meaningful, and more relevant to our lives today. Picture this scene. Abraham, carrying the cultural DNA of Mesopotamian civilization that had been shaped by centuries of African influence, receives his first divine calling in Genesis 12:1. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will shew thee. But this wasn't a command to abandon his heritage. This was a call to carry the best of that heritage into a new covenant relationship that would transform the world. The land that God showed Abraham wasn't empty territory. Canaan was a crossroads where African, Asian, and European trade routes intersected, where different peoples and cultures met and mingled, where the diversity that God intended for humanity was already taking shape. When Abram arrived in Canaan, he wasn't entering foreign territory. He was coming home to a land that reflected the multicultural reality of God's kingdom. But here is what's fascinating about Abraham's spiritual development. The deeper he goes in his relationship with God, the more he connects with practices and wisdom that have clear African roots. Take his understanding of astronomy and cosmic cycles. When God promises to make his descendants as numerous as the stars, Abraham doesn't need an explanation of what stars are or how to count them. He already has sophisticated understanding of celestial patterns that aligns perfectly with advanced African astronomical knowledge. African civilizations had been mapping star patterns, predicting celestial events, and using astronomical knowledge for navigation and agriculture for thousands of years before Abraham's time. The Great Pyramids of Egypt, the stone circles of Nubia, the astronomical temples of Ethiopia all demonstrate levels of cosmic understanding that wouldn't appear in other cultures until much later. Abraham's immediate comprehension of God's stellar metaphor suggests that this knowledge was part of his cultural background, part of the African influence that shaped his worldview. The same pattern appears in his understanding of mathematics and large numbers. When God promises that Abraham's descendants will be like the sand on the seashore, Abraham grasps the concept of infinity, of numbers too vast to count, in ways that suggest familiarity with mathematical concepts that were highly developed in African civilizations. The decimal system, advanced geometry, complex calculations for building and engineering, all of these mathematical tools were being used in Africa long before they appeared elsewhere. Abraham's approach to governance and leadership also reflects African models that emphasized consensus building, community involvement, and collective decision-making. When he negotiates with the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 14, when he intervenes to rescue Lot, when he establishes treaties with local rulers, Abraham consistently uses diplomatic approaches that prioritize relationship building over pure power politics. This isn't Middle Eastern strongman leadership. This is African Ubuntu philosophy in action, the understanding that individual success depends on community well-being. The spiritual practices that Abraham develops as his relationship with God deepens also show clear connections to African traditions that had been seeking the divine for centuries. His habit of building altars wherever God speaks to him, his understanding of sacred space and sacred time, his integration of worship with daily life. All of these practices align with African spiritual traditions that recognize the presence of the divine in natural settings and everyday activities. When Abraham builds his first altar in Canaan at Shechem, Genesis 12:7 tells us, "And the Lord appeared unto Abraham, and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Lord, who appeared unto him." But this wasn't Abraham's first experience with altar building. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamia shows that the regions where Abraham grew up had altar traditions that came from African influence, practices that treated certain locations as sacred meeting places between heaven and earth. His understanding of sacrifice and offering also reflects African traditions that saw these practices not as appeasement of angry gods, but as communion with the divine, as ways of expressing gratitude and maintaining relationship with the Creator. When Abraham offers sacrifices throughout his journey, he's not trying to earn God's favor. He's celebrating and maintaining a relationship that he understands in ways shaped by African spiritual wisdom. Special outstanding scene. The test of Isaac in Genesis 22 becomes even more powerful when we understand it through this lens. When God asks Abraham to offer Isaac as a sacrifice, Abraham's willingness to obey isn't based on blind submission to arbitrary divine commands. It's based on deep understanding of how the divine works, understanding that has been shaped by African spiritual traditions that recognize the Creator as ultimately good, ultimately trustworthy, even when divine actions seem incomprehensible. Abraham's confidence that God will provide a lamb for the burnt offering comes from spiritual wisdom that understands the character of the divine in ways that go beyond simple rule following. When he tells Isaac in Genesis 22:8, "My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering," he's speaking from deep spiritual insight that has been formed by centuries of African theological reflection on the nature of the Creator. The intervention of the angel and the provision of the ram caught in the thicket isn't just divine rescue from a difficult situation. It's confirmation of spiritual understanding that Abraham has developed through his connection to African wisdom traditions that always recognize the Creator as a God of life, not death, of blessing, not curse, of provision, not deprivation. Abraham's prophetic abilities also align with African traditions of spiritual insight and divine communication. His ability to intercede for Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 18, his understanding of divine justice and mercy, his skill in spiritual negotiation with the Almighty, all suggest familiarity with prophetic traditions that were highly developed in African cultures. The conversation between Abraham and God about the destruction of Sodom reveals sophisticated theological understanding that goes far beyond simple rule following. When Abraham asks in Genesis 18:25, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" he's engaging in theological dialogue that demonstrates deep understanding of divine character, divine justice, and the relationship between individual righteousness and community judgment. This kind of theological sophistication doesn't develop in isolation. It comes from traditions of spiritual reflection, community discussion, and prophetic insight that had been developing in African cultures for centuries. Abraham's ability to engage God in this kind of dialogue suggests that he's drawing on theological resources that go far beyond his individual experience. His understanding of covenant also reflects African traditions that saw agreements between communities, between leaders, and between human divine realms as sacred bonds that involved entire peoples across generations. When God establishes covenant with Abraham, both parties understand that this isn't just an individual arrangement. This is a community commitment that will affect nations, peoples, and civilizations for centuries to come. The physical sign of circumcision that God chooses for the covenant connects to African practices that used physical marking to indicate community membership, spiritual commitment, and generational responsibility. Abraham's immediate acceptance of this practice suggests familiarity with similar traditions, understanding of how physical signs can carry spiritual significance across generations. But here is what's really remarkable about Abraham's spiritual journey. As he moves deeper into covenant relationship with the one true God, he doesn't abandon his cultural heritage or his African connections. Instead, he transforms them, sanctifies them, and uses them as building blocks for a new kind of relationship with the divine that will become the foundation for all subsequent biblical revelation. His hospitality traditions become the model for welcoming divine messengers. His astronomical knowledge becomes the framework for understanding divine promises. His mathematical concepts become the language for grasping divine abundance. His governance experience becomes the template for leading covenant community. His spiritual practices become the foundation for worship that pleases the heart of God. This integration of African wisdom with divine revelation creates something entirely new in human history. Abraham becomes the first person to combine the best of human cultural development with direct divine communication, creating a model of faith that transcends cultural boundaries while honoring cultural contributions. The nations that come from Abraham's lineage carry this integrated heritage forward, spreading African-influenced biblical faith across the ancient world and creating connections between African civilizations and covenant communities that continue throughout biblical history. The Israelites who go down to Egypt don't go as strangers. They go as relatives returning to a land where their ancestor had established relationships and built bridges. The wisdom literature that develops in Israel shows clear influences from African philosophical traditions. The Psalms reflect poetic forms that appear in African praise traditions. The Proverbs echo wisdom sayings that had been developing in African cultures for generations. Even the prophetic tradition that becomes central to biblical revelation shows connections to African prophetic practices that emphasized social justice, community responsibility, and divine intervention on behalf of the oppressed. Abraham's African heritage doesn't diminish his role as the father of faith. It explains how he was able to become the father of faith in ways that would impact every nation, every people group, every culture on earth. His genetic diversity, his cultural competence, his spiritual depth, all prepared him to become the kind of patriarch who could truly father many nations and establish covenant relationship that would bless all the families of the earth. Now, we need to talk about the cover-up. And this is where things get uncomfortable for a lot of people. The evidence we've been discussing isn't hidden in obscure academic journals or buried in archaeological sites that nobody can access. This information has been available for decades, sometimes centuries. The real question isn't whether Abraham had African heritage. The real question is why this truth has been systematically suppressed, ignored, and explained away by religious institutions that should have been celebrating it. The whitewashing of biblical history didn't happen overnight. It was a deliberate, systematic process that served specific political and economic interests, and it required the cooperation of religious leaders, academic institutions, and cultural influencers who had more to gain from maintaining false narratives than from telling the truth. Let's start with the medieval period, when European scholars began translating biblical texts and creating commentaries that would shape Christian understanding for centuries. These scholars weren't working in cultural vacuums. They were part of societies that were beginning to develop racial hierarchies, societies that needed biblical justification for the social structures they were creating. When medieval Europeans encountered African civilizations through trade warfare and exploration, they found advanced societies with sophisticated theology, impressive architecture, and cultural achievements that challenged European assumptions about racial superiority. The solution wasn't to acknowledge African excellence. The solution was to rewrite history in ways that minimized African contributions and maximized European importance. Biblical interpretation became a key battlefield in this historical revision. If Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had significant African heritage, if the chosen people of God included African bloodlines from the very beginning, then European claims to special divine favor became much harder to maintain. So African connections had to be explained away, minimized, or ignored entirely. The process accelerated dramatically during the era of Atlantic slave trade, when European and American economies became dependent on enslaved African labor. Slavery required biblical justification, and that justification became impossible to maintain if biblical heroes were recognized as having African heritage. The curse of Ham in Genesis 9 became a central text for pro-slavery theology, but this interpretation required ignoring the fact that Ham's descendants included not just Africans, but also Canaanites, Egyptians, and other peoples who played positive roles throughout biblical history. More importantly, it required ignoring the fact that Abraham himself had married into Ham's lineage through Hagar and Keturah, making the supposed curse meaningless as a justification for enslaving Abraham's African relatives. So biblical commentaries began emphasizing Abraham's Semitic heritage while downplaying his African connections. Hagar became just a servant instead of an Egyptian princess. Keturah became a minor footnote instead of the mother of 6 nations. The sophisticated African civilizations that Abraham encountered became primitive cultures that contributed nothing to his spiritual development. Academic institutions played crucial roles in maintaining these false narratives. Seminary curricula emphasized European theological traditions while ignoring African contributions to biblical interpretation. Archaeological programs focused on sites that supported European-centered narratives, while underfunding research that might reveal uncomfortable truths about African connections to biblical history. Art and popular culture reinforced these distortions by consistently portraying biblical figures as European in appearance, dress, and cultural practice. Centuries of paintings, sculptures, and later films created visual impressions that made it almost impossible for people to imagine Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob as anything other than white Middle Eastern patriarchs. The damage wasn't limited to historical understanding. These false narratives created theological problems that continue to plague the church today. When biblical heroes are stripped of their cultural diversity, when their connections to different ethnic groups are minimized or ignored, the result is a gospel that seems relevant only to certain populations, instead of the universal message that God actually intended. African Christians throughout history recognized these problems and tried to correct them, but their voices were systematically marginalized by religious establishments that had invested too much in false narratives to change course easily. African theologians who pointed out biblical evidence for Abraham's African heritage were dismissed as biased. African scholars who highlighted archaeological evidence supporting African connections to biblical history were accused of wishful thinking. Even when the evidence became overwhelming, the response wasn't honest acknowledgement, but creative reinterpretation, designed to maintain existing power structures. African civilizations that clearly influenced biblical cultures were explained as recipients of influence rather than contributors. African wisdom traditions that obviously shaped biblical literature were dismissed as coincidental similarities. African theological insights that enriched biblical understanding were ignored or attributed to other sources. The conspiracy of silence reached into the highest levels of religious leadership. Denominational hierarchies that knew better chose to maintain comfortable lies rather than confront uncomfortable truths. Seminary professors who understood the evidence chose to perpetuate false narratives rather than challenge systems that provided their livelihood and status. Publishing houses reinforced these distortions by consistently rejecting manuscripts that challenged established interpretations while promoting books that supported existing biases. Biblical commentaries, study Bibles, and theological reference works created circular reinforcement systems where false information was repeated so often that it became accepted as fact. The technological revolution should have changed this dynamic by making information more accessible and allowing suppressed voices to be heard. Instead, many religious institutions doubled down on false narratives, using new media to spread old lies more efficiently while using their institutional authority to dismiss contrary evidence. Social media algorithms that favor engagement over truth often amplify sensational claims while bearing careful scholarship. Online theological education programs reproduce the same biased curricula that have shaped seminary training for generations. Popular religious influencers with large platforms continue to promote whitewashed biblical interpretation because it's what their audiences expect to hear. The result is a religious landscape where millions of sincere believers hold biblical views that are not just historically inaccurate, but spiritually impoverishing. When Abraham's African heritage is hidden or denied, believers lose access to the full scope of God's covenant promises. When the multicultural reality of biblical history is suppressed, the gospel message loses its power to unite people across ethnic and cultural lines. Young people, particularly young African Americans, grow up in churches where biblical heroes look nothing like them, where biblical narratives seem disconnected from their cultural experience, where God's promises appear relevant to everyone except people who look like they do. The psychological and spiritual damage of this disconnection is incalculable. But the damage isn't limited to African Americans. When white believers are taught false narratives about biblical history, when they're led to believe that God's chosen people looked like them and shared their cultural background, the result is spiritual pride that undermines genuine faith and creates barriers to cross-cultural understanding that God never intended. The institutional church investment in false narratives has created a crisis of credibility that extends far beyond questions about Abraham's ethnic background. When religious leaders are willing to suppress truth about biblical history to maintain comfortable lies, why should anyone trust their interpretation of biblical theology? When institutions that claim to follow the God of truth systematically promote historical falsehood, their moral authority in other areas becomes questionable. The cover-up has also created unnecessary divisions within the body of Christ. Different ethnic groups have developed competing biblical interpretations partly because the full multicultural reality of biblical history has been suppressed. Instead of celebrating the diversity that God built into His covenant from the beginning, different communities have had to fight for recognition of their biblical connections. But here is what's remarkable about this moment in history, that the truth is becoming impossible to suppress. Archaeological discoveries are providing overwhelming evidence of African connections to biblical civilizations. Genetic research is revealing the diversity of ancient populations in ways that make racial categories meaningless. Historical scholarship is uncovering centuries of suppressed information about African contributions to biblical development. More importantly, a new generation of believers is demanding honest engagement with biblical evidence regardless of where that evidence leads. Young pastors, theologians, and scholars are refusing to perpetuate comfortable lies, just because lies have institutional support. They're asking hard questions, challenging false assumptions, and insisting that the God of truth deserves better than half-truth from His people. The institutional resistance to this truth-telling reveals how much religious establishments have invested in maintaining false narratives. The emotional reactions, the attempts to dismiss evidence, the personal attacks on scholars who challenge established interpretations, all demonstrate that this isn't really about historical accuracy. This is about power, privilege, and institutional control that depends on keeping certain truths hidden. But truth has a way of surfacing, especially when it's truth about God's character and God's purposes. The same God who called Abraham out of Mesopotamia is calling His people out of false narratives that diminish His glory and limit His gospel. The same God who promised to bless all nations through Abraham is insisting that all nations be included in the full story of His covenant people. The cover-up is ending, and it's ending because God's people are demanding the whole truth about their heritage, their identity, and their place in biblical history. The question isn't whether this truth will continue to emerge. The question is whether religious institutions will lead this process of truth-telling or be dragged through it kicking and screaming. So what does this mean for you? What does it mean to discover that Abraham, the father of faith, carried African blood in his veins? What does it mean to understand that the covenant promises of God were given to a man whose heritage connects every continent, every people group, every nation on earth? It means you are part of this story, not as an outsider looking in, not as someone trying to claim connection to promises that weren't meant for you. You are a direct heir to covenant blessings that were established through a patriarch whose African heritage makes those blessings accessible to every child of God regardless of their ethnic background. When God told Abraham in Genesis 12:3, "And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed," He wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was making a literal promise that Abraham's diverse heritage would create pathways for blessing that would reach every corner of the globe, every ethnic community, every cultural group that humanity would ever produce. You need to understand something that religious institutions have tried to keep hidden from you. The promises God made to Abram weren't limited to one ethnic group or one geographical region. They were universal promises made through a universal patriarch whose genetic and cultural diversity prepared him to father nations that would span the earth. Romans 4:16 makes this crystal clear. Therefore it is of faith, that it might be by grace, to the end the promise might be sure to all the seed, not to that only which is of the law, but to that also which is of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. Paul isn't trying to spiritualize away ethnic connections. He's explaining that Abraham's physical and spiritual heritage creates covenant access for everyone who follows his example of faith. But here's what's revolutionary about understanding Abraham's African heritage. You don't have to choose between ethnic pride and biblical faith. You don't have to abandon your cultural identity to claim covenant promises. You don't have to pretend that biblical heroes looked like someone else in order to follow their example. Abraham's African blood flows through covenant history, connecting the wisdom of ancient African civilizations to the redemptive purposes of God. When you embrace your heritage, when you celebrate your cultural background, when you honor the traditions of your ancestors, you're not moving away from biblical faith. You're moving deeper into the multicultural reality that God established from the very beginning. The strength that carried your ancestors through slavery, the resilience that sustained them through segregation, the dignity that they maintained despite systematic oppression. All of these qualities connect directly to the covenant character that Abraham demonstrated throughout his journey. The same faith that allowed Abraham to leave everything familiar and follow God into unknown territories is the same faith that sustained generations of African Americans who refused to give up hope despite overwhelming circumstances. The hospitality traditions that characterize African American communities, the emphasis on family and community support, the integration of spiritual practice with daily life, the commitment to justice and equality, all of these values align perfectly with the covenant principles that Abraham established for his household. When you stand up for justice, you're walking in Abraham's footsteps. When he rescued Lot from the kings who had captured him, Abraham wasn't just helping family. He was demonstrating the covenant principle that God's people have responsibility to intervene on behalf of the oppressed, to use their resources and influence to protect the vulnerable, to stand against systems that exploit and dehumanize others. When you build businesses and create economic opportunities in your communities, you're following Abraham's example of wealth building and resource development that benefits entire populations. Abraham did accumulate wealth for personal consumption. He used his resources to support extended family, to employ workers, to invest in community development that created prosperity for everyone connected to his household. When you prioritize education and pass down wisdom to the next generation, you're continuing traditions that Abraham established when he taught his children and his servants about covenant relationship with God. Genesis 18:19 records God's confidence in Abraham's teaching ability. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord, to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken of him. The excellence that you pursue in every area of life, the refusal to accept mediocrity or settle for less than your potential, connects directly to the covenant standard that Abraham established for his descendants. God didn't call Abraham to be average. He called him to be the father of many nations, to establish standards of faith and character that would influence civilization for millennia. Your creativity, your innovation, your ability to find solutions to complex problems, all of these gifts connect to the pioneering spirit that allowed Abraham to navigate unfamiliar territories, establish relationships with diverse peoples, and build bridges between different cultures and civilizations. The prophetic voice that speaks through African American communities, the ability to see injustice clearly and call it out boldly, connects to the prophetic tradition that Abraham established when he interceded for Sodom and Gomorrah. You have inherited not just his blood, but his boldness in approaching the throne of grace on behalf of people who need divine intervention. Your music, your preaching, your storytelling all carry forward the oral traditions that preserved covenant history through generations before written records became common. The call and response patterns in African American worship, the emphasis on communal participation rather than individual performance, the integration of scripture with personal testimony, all reflect worship styles that have roots in Abraham's African heritage. But here is what you need to understand about your inheritance. This isn't just about claiming blessings. This is about accepting responsibility. Abraham's covenant with God included obligations as well as privileges. When you claim Abraham as your father, when you embrace your place in covenant history, you're also accepting the responsibility to live in ways that honor his legacy and advance God's purposes in the earth. Genesis 17:1 records God's instruction to Abraham, "Walk before me and be thou perfect." This isn't a command to be sinless. This is a call to integrity, to wholeness, to living in ways that align with covenant principles regardless of external circumstances or cultural pressures. You are called to the same standard of excellence, the same commitment to justice, the same willingness to stand for truth even when it's costly, the same faith that acts on God's promises even when the evidence suggests otherwise. The blessing of Abraham that Galatians 3:14 promises comes that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. You have access to the same spiritual resources that enabled Abraham to believe God's promises about becoming the father of many nations even when he and Sarah were past childbearing age. You have access to the same divine guidance that led Abraham through unfamiliar territory to the land that God had promised to show him. You are not limited by the circumstances of your birth, the neighborhood where you grew up, the educational opportunities you did or didn't have access to, or the financial resources available to your family. You are a child of Abraham, here to covenant promises that transcend natural limitations and create supernatural possibilities for anyone who walks by faith. The same God who called Abraham out of Mesopotamia is calling you out of limited thinking, out of victim mentality, out of spiritual poverty that accepts less than covenant provision. You are destined for nations, not neighborhoods. You are called to influence civilization